Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matti Apro, I'm a medical oncologist based in Genoli in Switzerland, and it's my great pleasure and honor to be chairing this meeting organized by UICC on integrating older adults into cancer research. I also just recently joined UICC as a member of the board, so that's another reason why I'm here in front of you. As you all know, the issue that the whole world is facing, by proportion, in some countries it's much more acute than in others, but clearly the number of persons of a certain age is increasing. And in many areas and in health, we don't have the right solutions. We need to understand better. And to understand better, we need the research. So this is going to be a central theme of this session. We would like to thank very much Mark and the team of the London Global Cancer Week that is having us during this week here. If we were able to get everyone together and fly some people over, it's because UICC has now for at least 2 years, if I'm not wrong, has a grant from Sanofi that allows us to develop a certain number of initiatives, and several of them are in collaboration with the International Society of Geriatric Oncology. So some of you are here, many others are somewhere around the world on the internet, as nowadays we tend to have these so-called hybrid meetings. And I would just like to ask those that are present here to remember that they have these so-called smartphones that tend to ring at the wrong moment. So put them on silence, please. And those who are elsewhere, mute your mics, because it could be that there would be some background noise for those that are online. In the system, there's a chat function. I believe you know nowadays how to use the chat function. The team of UICC present here will monitor the chat and will transfer that via WhatsApp to me, as we didn't make a more complicated system in order for me to know what are your questions, because that's what we would like to have from the floor here and from those who are there once we have gone through the presentations. So, without further ado, we will continue with the real crux of the matter, which is to go through some various areas. And the first one is the local boy, Professor Richard Sullivan. He is at King's College. I think he is just in another building a few hundreds of yards away from here. He was commenting on the fact that it makes life so easy to be in buildings which are far away. That's nothing unusual for universities that date from a certain time, like King's College does. I don't need to introduce Richard much more than that. He is extremely active in many areas, and he certainly has a very important perspective from the oncopolicy perspective on one of the issues that we all have to face, which is ageism and cancer treatment. So, Richard, the floor is yours, 9 minutes and 65 seconds.
Matti, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen online, everyone in the audience, marvellous to be here, and a very warm welcome to King's College London as well on this, I was going to say, rather chilly Friday. So I'm going to dive straight in, if I may, with my first slide. Marvellous, I can see it there. That's basically London on a good day when it's not raining. This is you and I and everyone in the world is basically getting older. Back in 1950, this is what the world looked like. And what we basically saw was, of course, the percentage of the population over the age of 60, and I'm going to use that as a very dangerous cutoff here for getting older. Not old, but getting older, versus life expectancy was this. And each individual bubble is a country. And what you can see is most countries were demographically young, and very few percentage of the population was above the age of 60. But of course, since then, we've seen an incredibly rapid increase in two things. One is the demographic effect. Firstly, countries are getting bigger. There are more people on the planet. And secondly, we are living in an aging world. We're going through the demographic and the epidemiological transition quickly. We went through it quickly in the West. Low and middle income countries are going through the demographic transition even faster. So they have, in terms of their cancer treatment pathways, in terms of ageism for health within cancer, a far, far more serious problem in a sense than we have in terms of having to deal with their aging population. Now, just very broadly to make the point here, aging populations also lead to downstream pressures on society's economies. It's called the dependency ratio. It's the number of active people in employment versus those who are retired. So all of this is creating stresses in individual populations. There is an amazing amount of scholarship in this area. If the most cursory examination of the scholarship in the Web of Science, in books, is amazing. So vast numbers of perspectives. Anthropologists have written on this subject, social scientists, philosophers, all the way to the famous Atul Gawande, who actually muses quite a lot in his book on what it feels like to be growing old and what growing old means, what an elderly cancer patient feels, and what that means when we talk about the end of life as well. So the scholarship in here, everything we're talking about today, in some form has been attacked by different disciplines to try and make sense of it. Yet we still have a great deal of ageism within and across cultures. This is a marvelous paper. There are very few papers out there that really get to the heart of the matter, which is across cultures and within cultures, very diverse cultures, when you put them all together, what do people think about being old? And sadly, what you can see there is, and I'm desperate to say this, is attractiveness, everyday tasks and new learning. You're going all the wrong way there. But of course, knowledge, wisdom, received respect, all improving. Family authority seems to wane as you get older. And the view is that life satisfaction as well is kind of middle of the road. But what the point of this paper really is that every country around the world is very, very different. And this is a really interesting paper for that is, it's extremely different. If you look at somewhere like Serbia and you look at the societal views of aging in Serbia, they have a very high percentage of population over 65, and they're quite ageist, according to socio-cultural analysis. Why is this important? Well, it determines how society views elderly. It also determines how healthcare workers, including cancer workforce, view the elderly. And as you can see, if you're in China or India, New Zealand, Malaysia, things are much better. So this is quite interesting information because it sets the context and the milieu. Ageism within cancer services and systems. This is a statement that myself and Martin Prince wrote back in 2015, and we said the fitness for purpose for health services and systems for older adults and their complex interacting chronic medical and social difficulties is open to question. What we were trying to put across here is when you stand back and you look at the way that cancer services and health system services are generally delivered in nearly all systems across the world, very few of them take any real hard notice of the elderly patient. Even where we're sitting in here today, when we think about the needs of moving an elderly individual who lives on their own with restricted mobility from their home to the cancer centre, we just make the assumption that they will somehow manage to miraculously make it. Or we put them on hospital transport, which can take hours and hours and hours to wait for. And we don't even think often about the number of times we have to bring them in for treatments. You think about the treatments now in cancer, they're increasingly complex, you're having to bring people in more and more. This is what I meant about ageism structurally embedded within services and systems. But this is not just in high-income countries, this is a truism across the world. And the point I want to make is people often think that ageism within cancer research is just a problem for high-income countries. Actually, it's a major problem for low and middle-income countries as well. There's significant burden in the elderly, in cancer, and there's also significant ageism. And with that goes issues of comorbidities. When we look at comorbidities and compounding comorbidities, there's always been an assumption as we develop, we compress morbidity. That is not true. Actually, the morbidity in countries is the same, if not increasing. In other words, our cancer patients come in now with heart failure, diabetes, musculoskeletal issues, and all of those compounding effects also bring issues of ageism within individual health services and systems. And cancer services and systems are designed or just are ageist in most countries, as I said. The dots on the left in India represent patients moving from all over India to access cancer care at Tata Memorial Centre in Maharashtra, which is over on the far left there. Those are extraordinary distances to make if you are young and relatively fit with support. And you have to imagine if somebody is of a particular vintage having to make those sorts of distances. So the problem is we design and structure our services in a way often that we don't think about access. And I mean geographic access. How easy is it to get there? We just make the assumption everyone will be able to get there. Other individuals who have talked about this from the anthropology community, like Omar Dawachi, have also reflected that in societies like the Middle East as well, where you have less embedded ageism within cultural societies, they still don't create healthcare services with the elderly in terms of access in mind. And why are all our cancer care systems becoming more ageist? And this is slightly provocative, and I put this up to be provocative in a sense. This is my view. If your focus is technology, if your problem is molecular, the molecular nature of cancer, if your solutions are all drugs and techs, then you lose sight of the person. And I would strongly argue that the ethos of a lot of orthodox cancer medicine around the world is this idea of precision cancer medicine, which is not holistic care. And that's part of the trade-off. And this is something Pramesh and C.S. Pramesh from India, myself and Chris Booth wrote ages ago. And it's not to deny the benefits of technologies, which are amazing in cancer care. It's just to say the focus has been too much on the molecular and the technology and not enough on the individual human beings as a whole. And finally, to say solutions, I want to end on something positive. I hand back to the chair here. Changing cultures and traditions takes time. As I said right at the beginning, part of this is an embedded cultural and traditional problem that we have. As I say to people, tradition is not the worship of embers, it's the transmission of fire. So things can be changed. Organizational structure of our cancer service and system has to be pro-elderly. Not just taking elderly into account, but pro-elderly, because that is the reality of all our future populations. What makes this work and what makes changes? Well, national audits and studies. When these are done properly and when you can see the data, actually systems do change. And this is a fantastic article. This is actually from the USA here, from the SEER database, showing that following the audits from SEER, following some very strong pro-elderly policies within surgical oncology for bowel cancer, what you saw here was a dramatic improvement in outcomes, and this is a study of the over 80s, okay? And what it says, the last line is, however, many patients not selected for surgery die of unrelated causes, reflecting good surgical selection. And what that means is you've actually done the triage correctly. You've said this person is not fit for surgery, they will not benefit. And this is, I think, a real moment for hope, and there are lots of publications coming out now showing that the audits can actually change clinical practice, and what you then get is services and systems which are pro-elderly. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Richard. So after this brilliant introduction by Richard Sullivan, Anthea Cree is going to be discussing with us about the perspective of oncology and geriatrics. She's a consultant clinical oncologist working at the Clatterbridge Cancer Centre in the UK and co-chair of the British Geriatric Society Special Interest Group in Geriatric Oncology. So, Anthea, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much. And I think Richard has really well outlined why this isn't just a problem for people who are interested in oncogeriatrics. This is an issue for all of us. And I'm coming at this as a practicing clinical oncologist, so I see older patients in clinic. I can still remember a time when the barriers to research were the inclusion criteria that said there was an upper age limit and the patients over 70 weren't eligible. And for me in oncology, that was one of the reasons I became interested in this area, because patients over the age of 70, however fit they were told that they shouldn't have cisplatin with their radiotherapy because of a subgroup analysis of a larger meta-analysis looking at cisplatin in head and neck cancer. That's now gone, but we still have a problem. And I think we've been talking about this for many, many years. And although that kind of obvious barrier has gone, lots of barriers still remain. And I think there's a number of reasons why it's important to get patients involved in research. So first of all, we need research that reflects the population that we're treating. The population in trials do not reflect the not so well 80-year-old who comes into my clinic. And I do not know what the best treatment for them is. And I do not know some of the outcomes that are important to them. So the impact of, for example, independence on their, of their treatment. So, and the other thing is that we know that people in trials do better. And so actually this is a form of discrimination. So I think that for all of those reasons, it's so important to address this area. So I had a look at the research, looking at the barriers of entrance to oncology, and there's a very good meta-analysis looking at 13 papers, which says it's very complicated and we're not quite sure what the answers are. And slightly worryingly, there was only, out of those 13 studies, there was only one study that looked at interventions and how we can improve this. So I think that we need to think about different barriers, and I think we need to think about the ways that we can address them as well, because as you said, I think it's good to look at the positives too. So I think quite a lot of it is making sure we ask our patients. If you look at the research, once patients are actually asked if they want to enter into clinical studies, there's actually a very small difference amongst older and younger patients, but the proportion of patients who are asked about study entry is smaller. And so if we don't ask, the patient doesn't have that option. And some studies have suggested that older patients really value the judgment of their doctors, maybe more than younger patients who come in with the kind of pages and pages of clinical trials and tell us what they want to do. It's some older patients just want the doctor to tell them what to do. So if the doctor doesn't mention a trial, then they won't mention it either. I think that one of the reasons, so I think there's good reasons why some older patients shouldn't be included in clinical trials. Sometimes people aren't fit enough, but I would argue that we actually don't assess them. So in my day-to-day practice as an oncologist, I have 40 minutes to see a new patient, assess their fitness, talk about possible treatment options, consent them for their treatment, and to kind of get everything set up. And you just can't assess a patient in that time, especially somebody who's older, because the older population is more variable. So 80% of people in their 80s are frail, but that means 30% of people in their 80s are frail, but 70% aren't. And actually, if we're not assessing people properly, how do we know which patient should go into a study or not? And I think the other thing is could we actually assess people and then support them in kind of accessing our studies? And I think that's something else that we aren't doing at the moment and potentially could even be built into clinical trials. I think that when we talk about personalised cancer care, we're often talking about molecular markers and we're not talking about the person. And I think if you think about it, the cost of all the imaging and investigations that we do is huge. The cost of our cancer drugs is huge. What do we not spend money on? We don't spend money on assessing a patient's fitness. And that is just crazy. It just doesn't make any sense. And we also don't know how people are going to do in a study because there's no evidence about how older patients do with more kind of intensive treatments. And I think that we also have to think about this kind of variety of cancer patients. There are some patients who are fit and should go into kind of standard cancer studies. There are some patients for whom that's never going to be an option. And I think even the older patients who do enter into studies do not reflect the general population. So they're fitter and they're a different group. So we don't have our standard population in studies. I think there are sort of different barriers. So obviously you mentioned kind of transport and getting to trial centres. Lots of older patients are carers, and I think that can have a really big impact on whether they want to kind of take part in a study. So I think there's lots of things about infrastructure. And I think as well, when we think about studies and moving forward with IT and all that kind of thing, people go, oh, well, older people can't really do that. And actually, I think there's evidence that with help and support, that older people can. So I think there's lots of barriers in our minds. I think we also have to look at the inclusion and exclusion criteria of trials. So we've lost that age barrier, but lots of trials have kind of very strict criteria about renal function, hepatic function, performance status, and again, in an older population, performance status actually isn't as good as kind of markers of frailty to assess a patient's fitness. So I think that that's something that we need to consider as well. And I think it's quite interesting because actually in the US, it's the commercial studies that have better inclusion of older adults and the academic studies that don't. Whereas I think in the UK, we kind of feel that it's the reverse is the case. So I think that that's something that we need to look at. And I think we also need to ask patients what they want, because as a kind of day-to-day practicing oncologist, what I feel like I'm lacking is the impact on people's daily life of the cancer treatment I'm giving them. They want to know whether it will stop them being independent, and I can't tell them that. So lots of older people do care about extension of life, but other people are more focused on quality of life, and I think we really need to bring those into our studies as well, so they're more relevant for a wider range of patients. So to finish, I think that there's things that can be done quite simply. So I think as oncologists and people in this area, we have to make sure that we're considering trials for any patient and not just thinking, well, they're 80. You know, I have lots of 80-year-olds who do really well in trials. I think on a kind of regional level, again, I think it's audits and looking at that disparity. So if some people are getting older people into trials and other people aren't, then why? And then I think it's looking at kind of more innovative ways, kind of on a policy level, thinking about things like value-based care and value-based pricing, so actually paying for the outcomes that people want. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Anthea. There's one common theme that I perceive, I don't want to influence anyone, but I have to say it anyway, is the fact that you and Richard have centered a lot on the patient, understanding who the patient is, what the patient wants. And I think that is really something that we have to keep in the back of our minds, even though we know that studies are very important, and it's our duty to explain these studies to them. And Charlotte has been doing this for quite a while. So Charlotte Paulin is at the Marsden, a hematology consultant, and very much involved with multiple myeloma, for which the UK has been running some studies, have really modified the approach to that disease throughout the world. And she has been involved with myeloma 11 and myeloma 14 studies. So she's going to tell us about the complexities of designing these studies in a way that we can really have the elderly in there, because multiple myeloma, as many of the cancers, is very frequent in a certain older population.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. I'm a hematologist amongst oncologists, so hopefully I will still fit in. Because of that, I thought I should just briefly mention what myeloma is, because perhaps the oncology audience may not be so familiar, but myeloma is a type of bone marrow cancer. It's a cancer of plasma cells, so the white blood cells that you have that normally generate antibodies, and it's the second most common hematological malignancy. And it causes quite a lot of significant impairment to patients' kidneys, to their bones. It causes infections and anemia, and this is how patients present. And as a hematologist, we're obsessed with looking down microscopes, so the cells on the left are what we look for when we're trying to diagnose myeloma in patients. And around 6,000 patients are diagnosed every year. We have only around 30% of patients who will survive for 10 or more years. And so it's a problem that we're trying to address in terms of improving treatments for patients. But particularly for today's audience, I wanted to just show this graph because for me, all of my patients are older patients. So I think you set a cutoff of maybe 60, which if you look on this graph is almost all of the bell-shaped curve. I think when I see patients in clinic, I tell them they're very young when I see them into their 70s, because that is true in comparison to some of my other patients. So the vast majority of patients are aged over the age of 70 and even older. And we see patients and we treat patients into their 90s. So for me, that's the kind of context in which I work. So all of my patients are older patients, I would say. But one thing that we know from studying outcomes in prior trials in myeloma, so this is from the Myeloma 11 trial, which was a big national study, we saw that excess mortality was really greatest in older patients. So we did have a lot of patients who were older within our trial. It was written to be an encompassing trial that allowing, with few inclusion and exclusion criteria, allowing a lot of patients in. You can see the yellow line at the top of this graph is those patients aged over 80. And the excess mortality, so compared to the normal life expectancy of the same age group in the population, is much greater for those patients of that age. And that for us is something that didn't really sit very well. We wanted to really understand why it was that excess mortality, not just their life expectancy, but excess mortality was greater for those patients, and how could we go about modifying that? And for me, when we're thinking about myeloma patients, but all oncology patients particularly, it's not really about how old a patient is. So it's obviously easy for us in the trial to look at age and look at outcome. But age is just a number, and a lot of our patients can be very fit and much older, or very unfit and much younger. And so we've really focused in the myeloma field on trying to understand frailty of patients and define frailty, and how frailty is affected by both the disease itself, but also by the other things that are going on in myeloma patients, the other comorbidities, the other biological processes that change as patients get older. And so for me, it's not really just about including older, frailer patients in clinical trials, but about really understanding what the best treatment might be for those different degrees of frailty. So as I say, a lot of my patients are older adults, but they all have different needs and all have different degrees of frailty, and we should be trying to address that for them. So in myeloma, we have a frailty scoring system that's been defined to try and help us to delineate these groups in order to study them. And we incorporate patient comorbidities, age, and then a series of assessments of their ability to carry out activities of daily living. And there are a number of ways of doing this, but in this study, they combined some specific scores and some specific measures to help define some groups of patients that were then divided into fit, intermediate fit patients and frail patients. And you can really see in this study that patients who are the most frail have the more side effects, the shortest outcomes from their treatment. So we really need to think about how we're delivering therapy to try and improve that. And I just at this point want to emphasize that I don't believe that all older patients can be subdivided into 3 different groups. They're all individuals, and when we see them in a clinic, we take all of those things into account. But in order to study interventions in a clinical trial, we do need to classify them in some way in order to try and assess whether or not we're improving outcomes for patients. And so up to now, the way that frailty in myeloma trials has been kind of incorporated was to take the whole group of patients, of older patients with myeloma, potentially randomize them between different approaches, and then subsequently look and see whether the approach had benefited subgroups of patients defined by frailty. But that means that the whole trial was really geared towards the whole group, and we weren't asking specific questions for those separate groups of patients. And so what we tried to do in addressing setting up the myeloma 14 trial was to say, actually, these patients are different. They have different needs, and they potentially need different treatment approaches. So we should think about whether that is a different way of setting up a trial to try and address that for patients. And so this is just that other way of thinking about this, which is to define the fitness of patients up front and then ask questions specifically in those groups. And so fitness was designed to answer a question as to whether frailty adapting therapy for patients could help improve outcomes. So if we delivered a different kind of therapy or a different dose of therapy to those patients of different age groups, could that help improve the outcomes? So most oncology treatments are defined as a standard dose, which is sometimes surprising to people because we give different doses to children, and we don't necessarily think about that in older patients. And so this is a randomized study to try and show whether or not this is the right approach. So this is slightly complicated, but essentially patients who are older patients are not eligible for a transplant, which is what we would deliver to a much younger patient, will be randomized between having the standard of care approach, which is to deliver therapy at standard doses and then adjust dosing based on toxicities that patients experience, or adapting their initial therapy up front based on that degree of frailty and delivering treatment at different doses based on that frailty. And we hope that by doing that, we will enable patients to stay on treatment for longer, have fewer side effects, and therefore benefit in terms of their disease staying in remission. But this is a randomized question, and we don't have the answers to this yet, although the hypothesis is that by defining treatment based on frailty, we'll be able to improve outcomes. I think it's also important to acknowledge, for me, that some of patient frailty as patients are older is actually determined by their disease. So because of their cancer, they are more frail. And therefore, as you treat patients, they can potentially become less frail because their cancer is being treated. And so within the study, we have a way of looking at that, and we can modulate dosing if their frailty status changes after every few cycles of treatment. And so just to show how we're doing with this is still an ongoing study, but this is the recruitment to the study. So we have 525 older patients in this study already, and we're aiming for around 700. So we hope to complete recruitment next year. And just to show a little bit about the baseline of those patients, so we have more than 40% of our patients are classified as frail. So a lot of those patients are aged over 80, not all. Some of them are frail based on their other features, but a lot of them are very much at the extreme of the older spectrum, I guess, much older than 60 at least. And then we have a kind of good cohorts of unfit and fit patients that will help us to try and answer this question in this trial. And I just wanted to come back, I think, the map you showed of India and patients trying to travel to treatment, I think is really critical to how we are aiming to deliver this throughout the UK. And the map on the left shows with a circle the number of patients recruited at multiple different sites throughout the UK. So we have sites that are running this trial all over the UK. I'm conscious that there are none currently in Northern Ireland and none at the very far north of Scotland. And that's something that we are working hard to try and address, because what we really want is to make sure that all older patients are able to access treatment in the trial, and that is best done by having centres and sites that are close to where those patients live. And the way we do this is to try and work with other doctors, with nurses, with pharmacists, with trial coordinators around the country to try and deliver this locally to patients. And we designed the study as part of a group of clinicians who are interested in delivering therapy for myeloma patients who are older, as part of the Myeloma Research Alliance, so trying to work together to deliver and improve outcomes for patients with myeloma who are older. So thank you.
So Charlotte showed to us, with the example of myeloma, some of the issues that we have to face when you want to organize a proper study looking at the older part of the population, and also suggested that we indeed do have some ways of understanding a little bit better, putting them into these three categories that can always be discussed, and I believe Nicolas is going to address this also, of fit, unfit, and frail. So I alluded to Nicolas. So Nicolas is Nicolas Battisti. He happens to be from the same hospital, But I chatting with him the other day, he told me that actually, yes, it's a big place. So he hadn't had the opportunity of meeting Charlotte yet. And now they are here sitting side by side, so they'll be able to talk to each other. Nicola is, besides his work at the Marsden, the president of the International Society of Geriatric Oncology, SIOG. And he also works closely with the European Cancer Organization, its Inequalities Focused Topic Network, which of course looks at one inequality, which is age. And he, in the UK, is with the clinical steering group of the National Audit for Breast Cancer in older patients. So Nicola, tell us a little bit more about how we can address the question of aging in cancer research.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a nice introduction and invitation to discuss these aspects today. It was striking to think that actually we've been knowing that older patients are underrepresented in clinical trials since 1999, when Laura Hutchins looked at the enrollment of older patients in more than 100 Southwestern Oncology Group clinical trials in the States, and showed that 25% of these patients at that stage were over the age of 65 versus 63% in the general US cancer patient population. With quite some impressive gaps. For example, breast, my disease-specific interest, 9 versus 49%. And it's also quite impressive to look at the lack of progress that we have made over time. 15 years later, Thuria, that was one of the greatest names in the field of geriatric oncology, looked at recruitment of older patients in NCI-sponsored clinical trials, phase 2 and phase 3, over a period of 10 years. At that stage, less than 10% of these patients were age 75 plus versus 28% in the general cancer patient population. And this is a problem for, obviously, for patients, but also for clinicians like me that see these patients in the clinic routinely. And obviously, we are not sure how to extrapolate this data to the routine clinical practice. So what is the applicability of these findings for routine practice? And this generates treatment variation. There were some recent data from Bridging the Age Gap study led by Linda Wild in Sheffield here in the UK, looking at treatment patterns for older people with primary breast cancer, 2013-2018, so contemporary cohort of patients with contemporary treatments, almost 3,000 women undergoing surgery. And even when we identified, by means of geriatric assessment, fit patients with high-risk disease, high-risk breast cancer based on the classical clinical pathological characteristics, less than 28% of these patients were offered chemotherapy, despite there is evidence of benefit for fit high-risk patients. On the right, you can see another nice analysis from Janine Mansi at Guy's here in London, the aging of barrier to chemotherapy analysis using SACT data here in the UK, to look at rates of use of systemic anti-cancer treatment in patients with stage 2 to 3 breast cancer across age groups. Obviously, in this funnel plot, every circle represents a trust. They are plotted against the caseload and the case-mix adjusted SACT use rate, so adjusted based on comorbidities, performance status, and other characteristics. As expected, there is obviously a significant drop in the use of SACT with increasing age, but look at the degree of variation in the use of SACT in the older age group as opposed to the younger age group, despite, again, case-mix adjustments. All the patients are heterogeneous. This is because as we age, we become increasingly diverse under the selective pressure of cancer itself, comorbidities, because we live in different places in the world with different level of access to healthcare, social support, and so on. And it's quite common experience for clinicians like us to see in the clinic fit patients, fit older patients with a longer life expectancy, where there is a small burden of, or no burden of functional impairment, comorbidities, polypharmacy, normal organ function, where the focus of care could still be prolonging survival. At the other end of the spectrum, frail, vulnerable individuals with significant additional competing risk of morbidity and mortality, with an increased risk of side effects on standard cancer treatment, where the focus should really increasingly shift towards quality over quantity of life. And sometimes telling the difference between these two categories of patients is very difficult if you use, as we were saying, for example, performance status. Reality is much more complex. Is this complex? It's not simply a matter of a reduction in the function of multiple organs and systems that we see with the aging process. It's also about an increased burden of comorbidities, functional impairments, malnutrition, cognitive problems, mood issues, lack of social support and activity that really make decision-making very complicated for this age group. And risks of over-treating and under-treating these patients quite significant. But on a positive note, we have learned over the years that from our geriatrician colleagues that if we integrate geriatric assessment and driven intervention in the care of older patients with cancer, there are a number of benefits to be achieved. These benefits are being much better in predicting what is the prognosis of that patient, what is the risk of side effects, complications, and cancer treatment, including, for example, physical decline, quite significant, meaningful for older individuals. We can impact treatment decisions, inform them better. We can find problems that are neglected, if I just consider ECOG, WHO, or Karnofsky performance status. And the last couple of years have been great for the geriatric oncology field because a number of phase 3 randomized clinical trials have also looked at impacts of intervention driven by geriatric assessments, showing, for example, that we can make systemic treatment safer by reducing hospital admissions, unplanned hospital admissions in this specific group. We can reduce grade 3+ toxicities. We can improve quality of life, and for surgical patients, reduce the risk of ITU admissions and postoperative admissions again. And over 30 years of research and clinical implementation, the geriatric oncology community has really come up with dedicated models of care that have been successfully implemented around the world by leveraging, for example, geriatric screening as a way to predict outcomes of geriatric assessment and easily implementable also in busy oncology clinics, by cross-contaminating and learning from each other with other specialties, for example, geriatrics throughout the whole cancer disease trajectory, by expanding the scope of traditional MDT, which is something that should go beyond simply medical oncology, clinical oncologies, or radiation oncologies, as we call it elsewhere in the world, surgery and nursing, but including, for example, additional allied care professionals that can actually do an awful lot of good for this patient and provide holistic care. We've also learned that there are several ways to make clinical trials more inclusive and meaningful for this patient population. One issue is certainly eligibility criteria. As we were discussing, is no longer a matter of mostly of upper age limits. It's a matter of additional eligibility criteria that really prevent all the patients from accessing clinical trials, so there is an opportunity to expand them. There is an opportunity to actually allocate treatments based on fitness consideration within clinical trials. There is the opportunity to select endpoints that are far more relevant for all the patients. It's not all about survival, progression-free, overall disease-free survival. It's all about quality of life, impact on physical function, treatment tolerability. These are the questions that patients ask me to ask in the clinic. Include geriatric assessment to also allocate patients to different treatments within clinical trials to predict the risk of individual toxicities, and use, again, novel trial methods, for example, prospective cohort study like bridging the age gap, pragmatic trials, extended trials to really understand barriers to healthcare for these patients, treatment patterns, and outcomes. The field of geriatric oncology has really come of age now. This is thanks to the hard work of the International Society of Geriatric Oncology that was founded in the year 2000, and a number of investigators and clinicians that around the world have really contributed to significant advancements in the field. There are now dedicated care models available in several areas of the world, not only just North America and Europe, but also Southern America, Far East, Oceania, research programs, very mature research programs, research groups like the Cancer and Aging Research Group, the OTC, that are driving research in this field. And it's great now to be able to work with additional stakeholders like UICC, ESMO, European Cancer Organization on these aspects. And these are our SIOC priorities to really advance the care of older patients with cancer at global level. This is a publication that my mentor, Martin Exner, published on Lancet Oncology last year that really highlights that the key aspects to consider are, first of all, education. We need to integrate geriatric oncology and geriatrics in the training curriculum of the cancer workforce. We need to provide educational opportunities like this one for practicing clinicians. We need to raise awareness in the general public about the importance of addressing the needs of older patients with cancer. We need better clinical practice. As I mentioned, implementing this consideration in routine clinical practice, developing guidelines on the basis of a critical review of the available evidence. We need to establish Center of Excellence in Geriatric Oncology, at least one for each country. The patient could also be referred to. We need more research because of these gaps of knowledge. We need to improve the relevance of clinical trials for older patients. We need to integrate geriatric assessment in trial design. There are several examples of this, as we have heard. We can also use technology to really meet the individual needs of these patients and collaborate, working in partnership. Obviously, our organization with several stakeholders, professional societies, agency, policymakers, patient advocacy to really also inform, for example, national cancer control plan at more global level, and to, for example, provide mechanism, opportunities of funding for more research and education in the field. We've seen this beautifully in a public policy meeting that we have held in Geneva, the UN, during our last meeting in October. And this is, to me, the dream, which I think it's actually a long-hanging fruit. It's an integration of tumor-specific considerations. We have learned to deal with additional complexities now because we become familiar with a number of biomarkers to drive anti-cancer treatment decisions, and which had the same shift when looking at our patients, moving away from simply considering performance status, chronological age as sole drivers of treatment decision, discussion with patients, but looking at, for example, geriatric assessment, geriatric screenings, consideration of life expectancy, what matters to patients, capturing this routinely in our discussion with patients. What is the organ function of this patient? What are the competing risks of these patients? Investigate, for example, whether we can also use aging biomarkers and integrate them alongside tumor-specific biomarkers to really come up with what, as we were saying, we should call precision oncology. And I'd like just to invite everybody to our next conference in November 2023 in beautiful Valencia, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Niccolo. This, in some ways, took from the previous presentation that you had not seen, but put them into a very nice perspective. And all the work of SIOG was very nicely presented. Actually, the meeting that was held with WHO in Geneva, I understand, is now publicly available. There's a link. So anyone interested, get in touch with Nadia Musolino. She has the link. She just sent it to me, and it was just provided this morning, I understand, Nadia. So it's very timely that we have the meeting this afternoon. We do have a couple of questions that have come here to my so-called smartphone. I've never understood why these are called smart. They're stupid instruments. But do we have a question right now in the room before I go to what I have here? Yes, please. You could just identify yourself and ask your question with the microphone so that everyone also on the web hears.
So I'm Susie Stanway, I'm an oncologist from the UK. I was just wondering if there's any guidance from the EMA and the FDA about collecting data sort of in the post-marketing surveillance stage, given the fact that we think older people are underrepresented in clinical trials. I appreciate it's not as good, but what the guidance is in that kind of stage of the drug's life cycle.
There is, I can take this. There is lots of work from FDA on this. With EMA, we are still, let's say, working on it. We had the opportunity, for example, to have EMA representatives at our public policy meeting in Geneva, and that's something that we are hoping to see increasingly also here in Europe, because that's part of the, you know, that's obviously a key aspect to really also make companies understand that they should actually drive this agenda increasingly. Yeah.
I would like to give a slightly different answer in the sense that actually EMA started this whole process a long time ago. Then FDA arrived a few years later, and now they have established some guidelines. EMA hasn't established full guidelines, but there are also EMA guidelines. No, the regulators are working on this. The problem is that this is not mandatory. It's a question of negotiations and what you do and how do you do it. So there's a long way to go, and that's what SIAG is trying to kind of push forward.
We have another question.
Richard?
I'm going to jump the gun because this article's coming out very soon. It's analysis of the regulatory changes that have occurred in EMA and FDA. When you look at what's going on with Project Orbis, accelerated approval, the focus is on speed. It's not on representativeness of the molecule going through into the population. Now, their argument is you'll be able to do that in the real world. You can do real-world data, real-world evidence. But then if you look at that, and that's been published in the European Journal of Cancer, Ajay Agarwal wrote this paper looking at all the real-world data studies, they're garbage, by and large. And they don't represent and reflect the realities of the real world. So we do have a bit of a twin problem here, actually, from regulatory. And I think, you know, you're absolutely right. Working on them and trying to get them to see reality is going to be really important.
Hi, it's a little
Nice to
comment.
see you.
Hi, Matthew. For where I'm sitting, from low middle income countries, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa especially, it might not look like the most urgent thing that we need to be talking about and researching in, but I will, from the point of inclusivity and that angle, commend the UICC for taking this up as one of its topics to deal with, particularly because, you know, it brings into focus and a group of people that are also treated inequitably, as we've been hearing. However, I'd like to also ask that the African organizations and researchers, such as AORTIC, be included in the multilateral studies because of, well, for inclusivity. And then also we have quite a lot of very healthy aging population. Contrary to belief, you have the pockets of people that just age, and there's not a crack in their tooth in Africa. There's always this anecdotal belief that it's to do with their diets, their lifestyle. They're very rural. They don't have any processed foods or lifestyle changes, not smoking, not drinking. So perhaps including that kind of group as well might tell us a little bit more. I see everybody nodding. Is that being done already? Thank you.
No, it's a very important comment you're making there. It's true that there's a lot that we have to look at, but together at the board of which you have been a member and I'm now a member, I think we'll work on that and get UICC in collaboration with SIOG to work on this. I do have here one comment coming through the chat, and this goes about to clinical trials, and it addresses to those that have been discussing the clinical trials. It says here, if you try to widen age inclusion in clinical trials, we will still have other inclusion criteria like limits for kidney and cardiac tests. That doesn't say cardiac tests, I'm saying cardiac, and liver function tests. So at the end, we will still have very well chosen patients. We should have studies that are specifically addressing the patients that have these potential issues. So what's your take on this, the two of you?
Yeah, I think and wholeheartedly agree. So when we're looking at commercial studies, that is quite often the case. So the inclusion criteria, although they don't set age cutoffs, will still exclude older patients by virtue of these other inclusion-exclusion criteria based on, because we know that older patients will have reduced creatinine clearance, reduced kidney function, to name but one. But there are many different ways in which those patients can be excluded in a sort of subtle way by having a lot of these different criteria you need to meet. And I guess that for me is where, as an academic group, we come in, because we can design a trial in the way that we want to design a trial, and we can write the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria in a way that enables more patients to participate. And that's the study that I mentioned, Myeloma 14 Fitness, is really kind of designed in that way to be inclusive. And the idea is to try and, in an ideal world, include all patients in the UK so that it becomes representative. And clearly we don't have that many patients in the study, but it should be potentially possible.
Thank you. I think that's another excellent question. I would say that also depends on what is the question that you want to investigate. So, for example, do you want to investigate what is the best management of this specific condition in a frail older patients? Or what is the best management of this condition in the general patient population with that specific malignancy? For example, within breast, there was a very good trial from ERTC looking at, led by Hans Wilders in Leuven, Belgium, looking at the use of de-escalated systemic regimen for metastatic HER2-positive disease. We tend to consider as a first-line treatment option sometimes a bit challenging chemotherapy and targeted treatment regimen in this specific setting. So the investigator came up with the idea maybe we can de-escalate the chemo component while carrying on using specific targeted agents. And that was a study that successfully recruited patients, was demonstrating a benefit of this approach while still looking at maintaining safety and a tolerable treatment approach. So, for example, you need specific study for older or frail patients, but you also need to be more inclusive. And perhaps, again, the opportunity is to include, again, geriatric assessment, something like, G8. It's a very easy and quick geriatric screening tool to then understand, is this patient fit enough for this standard treatment regimen, or should I maybe look at a de-escalated, safer treatment regimen? So I think you need both approaches, to be very honest.
You sound like a Swiss. Please.
Thank you very much. James Newcomb. We've been talking about inclusion and differences of treatment and research with patients with different morbidities and in different parts of the world. This is a kind of levelling up question about England, probably directed to Charlotte, actually, because I couldn't help noticing on the map you put up for research that's going on into myeloma that the patients that have been chosen are almost exclusively from the south, not entirely, but there are very, very few in the north. And I just wondered whether any research has taken place yet on different outcomes in the north and in the south, which could have to do with all kinds of other factors, but I think it's an interesting one.
And Thea wants to answer.
So obviously I can't speak about Charlotte's trial, and it sounded like she was making a big effort to be as inclusive as possible, but I think that's the other thing about frailty. Frailty is also associated with inequality. So I work in Liverpool. I have lots of very frail younger patients. And actually, there's lots of evidence that not only your life expectancy varies by your postcode, but also the age of your healthy life expectancy. So I think by not running trials in frail patients, we're actually kind of perpetuating more general inequalities. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, we actually have quite a lot of centres in the north of England, but not so many in the north of Scotland. So that's something we're kind of working on. But actually, the representation around England is not so disparate. But yeah, I think it is really important to make sure that the key is to have the centres near the patients, right? So the patients are everywhere, and we don't really want them to have to travel very far to receive treatment if they're at the extremes of age and frailty. And that's why trying to open in lots of sites. So there are 85 sites for the trial around the UK, and they're a combination of kind of big academic medical centres, but also district general hospitals and kind of other centres that are kind of closer to kind of big groups of patients.
I have noticed that Richard wanted to say something. Yes or no?
Yeah. Okay, so the research agenda, this is what I don't, and this is a different take on research agenda. So it infuriates me because actually a lot of the research agenda could be massively germane to the older population in terms of shorter courses, treatment holidays, COIN, Cleopatra, hyperfractionation for breast cancer. There's an enormous research agenda on making our pathways shorter, more condensed, less complex. Because at the moment, the research agenda is going the other way. More complexity, adding things in, and that is, I'm going to say, to be honest, that's counter to the aging population. So there's a huge opportunity here, and that benefits everyone in the world. I mean, we're talking about global cancer here. It benefits enormously other countries to have shorter courses because it's cheaper, for example. Much easier to get patients in and out. So I think there's maybe an idea here of teaming together this IOG agenda with this idea of a simpler research agenda as well.
I take the chairman's privilege to say that I like this conclusion, but I have a more important one, is that I would like to thank everyone, also those on the web that have participated and sent some comments on the chat. We can't take everything in, but we will be producing a summary of this meeting. It's going to be a joint venture of UICC and SIOG, and it will be soon available. And depending on how intense it is and how it is felt, maybe, and I'm taking again my privilege of chair of this session, we'll address it to a journal in which I must say I have a conflict of interest, as I'm one of those that helps Richard Sullivan in the Journal of Cancer Policy. So thank you very much.